Behind that tragedy lies one of the greatest scandals in Australian history. "40 years ago, a former Australian naval officer sat at the foot of his bed dictating a long statement into a borrowed tape recorder.
My name is Caban. I joined Voyager in September 1962 as executive officer.
Caban had served as second-in-command in the destroyer HMAS Voyager. Some of what he witnessed during that time appalled him.
I found the captain in the usual condition, with a vomit-soaked towel under his head, looking dreadful. It was quite desperate.
One evening I had formed the conclusion that if he ever had a drink at sea, the ship would be lost. I had no doubt about that at all.
More than a generation after the disaster, the Navy still trains its junior officers by taking them through the last moments on Voyager's bridge.
Speed coming on now, sir.
Is that range starting to close now?
600 closing.
Roger.
Just before 8 p.m, February 10, 1964, two ships engaged in joint night exercises 20 miles southeast of Jervis Bay. The aircraft carrier Melbourne, at almost 20,000 tonnes, was Australia's largest naval ship. On the bridge, Captain John Robertson, 47 years old, 34 years of naval service. Melbourne steamed at a steady 21 knots. Above, a Gannet anti-submarine aircraft waiting to practice touch-and-go passes along the carrier's flight deck.
Check starboard quarter. Starboard quarter clear, sir. Starboard 20.
Remembering, of course, this is at night, so whilst we can see things reasonably well, all Melbourne's seeing is side lights and stern lights.
Ahead, off Melbourne's starboard bow, the daring-class destroyer Voyager, ship's motto, "Where fate calls." At 3,500 tonnes, she was long and fast, but only a sixth the size of Melbourne. Voyager was commanded by Captain Duncan Stevens, 41 years old, 28 years in the Navy. He was at the chart table on the bridge. From the Melbourne, Robertson ordered Voyager to take up a new position off his stern.
Now, initially on Melbourne's bridge, as they observed Voyager, Voyager turned to starboard, which is what they expected to see. However, very soon after Voyager turned to starboard, the ship then altered around to port on later what would be described as a continuous course. But certainly, as Melbourne looked at Voyager, they initially went to starboard, then came around to port.
Melbourne was in tactical control. She had right of way. Voyager carried an absolute obligation to keep clear. Circling at 400 feet, the pilot dipped a wing of his Gannet to check Melbourne's position.
As I turned to do my run-up alongside the starboard side of the ship in the landing pattern, I remarked to my observer the rescue destroyer's not in its position, but I couldn't see where she was.
400 yards closing. Speed at 28 knots.
And now you're at the point of no return.
300 yards closing.
On board Voyager, for reasons we will never know, the turn to port continued unchecked. From 45 seconds before impact, there was nothing either ship could do. They were now closing at more than 30 knots.
The whole thing was from start to finish with over in just over a minute, and it all happened so quickly. You see, it was 1 minute all was well, and literally 1 minute later all was not well, and there was the collision.
The force of the impact turned Voyager onto her starboard side. Melbourne's stem drove directly into the destroyer's boiler room amidships. Voyager was broken in two.
I heard this garbled message of some urgency, which I didn't understand. And when I was lying there wondering what this was all about, there was this gigantic crash, and the ship moved over on its starboard side quite heavily, and my cabin was on the starboard side, down aft. Black.
The ship's broadcast switched on, and the executive officer made the broadcast hands to collision stations. Well, before the microphone switched off, the Melbourne had hit us.
The whole sky and the ship lit up as the two ships hit. And that's when I said a rude word and said, Melbourne's collected Voyager.
I said to my mate, gee, what was that? We must have hit a whale or a submarine, because we were exercising with submarines too at the time.
As I came out on the starboard side, there was HMAS Melbourne, right in front of me.
As the aircraft carrier's bow smashed into Voyager's bridge, Captain Stevens and two of his key senior officers were killed instantly. With them went any real hope of knowing why the destroyer had turned onto its fatal course.
As we climbed, you could see the wakes of the two ships, the fluorescent in the water was so clear. They were just etched on the ocean. And I'd realised, of course, what had happened.
I heard this scraping and like metal on metal and cables and sort of a moaning.
And the thought kept running through my mind at the time of the poor beggars down aft, you know, because I could see the bow sticking out of the water. And gradually it just sank into the sea without a ripple.
"82 of the destroyer's crew, 14 officers, 67 ship's company and 1 civilian, died in the collision or drowned before they could be rescued. Many were still teenagers at sea for the first time. It was the greatest loss of life in Australian peacetime history. News of the disaster would have to be handled with particular skill.
It was about 9:15 and a phone call, and a voice said, it's the duty officer at Navy office. I thought I should let you know that we have a signal indicating a collision between the Melbourne and the Voyager. And I remember saying, do you think it's serious? He said, sir, he said, the message indicates that the bow is separated from the stern. I said, that sounds serious to me. He says, yes, sir, I think it's serious.
At about 2 a.m, the phone rang, and it was Tony Eggleton, who was the Navy's public relations officer. And Tony said, look, something like this. He said, look, I hate to tell you this, but, very sombre, I hate to tell you this, but we've just sunk a ship, and it's one of ours.
And in all of that, no one told the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, as he told me later, heard about it on the ABC News.
The Chief of the Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Sir Hastings Harrington, had really decided that the public should not know about this until the next day. Menzies was not told at the time. He was at the lodge, and the Admiral made a very silly mistake. He should have immediately phoned the Prime Minister.
I don't think the Navy were aware of the political implications of the incident to begin with. It was something that the Navy felt that it could deal with in-house.
Well, I only heard about it, as Menzies did, first heard about it, on the ABC headline news at 7:45 the following morning. Here was the flagship of the RAN slicing through an Australian destroyer just 20 miles off the principal naval base of Australia, Jervis Bay.
It was a sad coincidence that the tragedy had occurred almost within sight of HMAS Creswell, the college at Jervis Bay where Australia's naval officers are trained. Both captains involved in the collision, Robertson and Stevens, were products of the pre-war cadet system. Selected as midshipmen at age 13, the Navy patiently turned them into an elite class of commanders.
If you take a 13-year-old boy and you take away, in many ways, his formative years and replace them with a rigorous regime of, one might call, indoctrination, of making them believe that they are special, they begin to believe very much in themselves, in their abilities, their place in the world, their place in Australian society. They begin to believe that this is almost like a monastic order.
Duncan Stevens, Voyager's captain, had struggled with the technical side of his training, but excelled at sports. His career as an officer was patchy. Though popular with the lower decks, he had a reputation for being short-tempered and impatient. Robertson, a few years senior, was a keen and gifted cadet, tall for his age. Sometimes aloof, he still mixed well with his men and rose smoothly through the ranks. By the early 1960s, Robertson was enjoying a settled family life and seemed destined for an admiral's flag.
This is all that remains. Relics of a proud ship, brought ashore at Jervis Bay some 26 miles from the scene of the disaster.
The initial rescue and recovery operation ended just after dawn. Robertson then dictated a confidential report of the incident for the officer commanding the Australian fleet.
I think it struck me as a flash of lightning at one stage that this is probably the end of my naval career, for no particular reason at that time, because we hadn't even worked out how it happened.
Helicopters run shuttle services from Jervis Bay to the Balmoral Naval Depot, with the more seriously injured cases. Ambulances, doctors and stretchers are waiting for them. 150 more survivors are still aboard Melbourne, which limped towards Sydney at 3 knots, her bow damaged by the force of the impact.
It was evident to me that this kind of mishap, which had already generated calls from all over the world, was going to be with us as an issue for quite a long time to come.
Melbourne crept towards the naval dock at Garden Island with her ensign at half-mast. The scenes rekindled memories of wartime 20 years earlier. Beyond the images of loss and reunion, journalists sought out Melbourne's captain. Robertson and his conduct were already under intense scrutiny.
What were your immediate thoughts, sir, when this happened?
I think in a situation like this, emotions don't come into it till later on, and one's thinking about what one has to do to tidy up the mess.
I think his strength was the fact that he contained it all. He'd been the sort of man who didn't share the Navy with the wife and family. My role was in the house and looking after the family, and that's what he expected.
With the ship secured and survivors disembarked, Robertson went ashore to present his condolences to the family of Voyager's captain.
The father of Voyager's captain, Sir Jack Stevens, was a very powerful figure in Canberra. He'd been a public servant and he'd been well connected politically. Now, most naval officers, even after mature reflection, looking at the situation, would say it was Stevens' fault. But certainly I think Sir Jack was taking very early steps to make sure that his son wasn't damned more than he needed to be.
Robertson told Sir Jack and Duncan Stevens' widow he could think of no reason why Voyager had turned into Melbourne's path. But the father of Voyager's dead captain must have had his suspicions. Sir Jack had already alerted the family lawyers just hours after the collision, even before his son's death was confirmed.
I think the following day I was telephoned on behalf of Captain Stevens by solicitor of his father, Sir Jack Stevens, to ask if I'd represent Duncan Stevens.
Everyone involved in the collision was interviewed at length by the Navy, then allowed their 1 week of survivors' leave. Tradition demanded that the armed services should be trusted to conduct their own investigations. At their new headquarters in Canberra, the Admirals prepared for a board of inquiry and possible court-martial, but the Prime Minister had other ideas.
Menzies called a press conference almost immediately and was visibly angry and said that he didn't think normal Navy procedures would be sufficient on this occasion. He was very upset. And it was then that he said he decided to have a Royal Commission.
Well, it was also motivated by the fact that he didn't trust that the Navy would look into it satisfactorily. That is, the Navy would have spared all its commanders in order of rank.
Events proceeded with extraordinary speed. Just a fortnight after the collision, the Royal Commission held its first sitting. The Commonwealth Industrial Court in Sydney was pressed into service for the Commission hearings.
Captain Robertson entered these proceedings thinking that all he had to do was come along, tell the truth, everyone would believe him and the thing would be over in a fortnight and he could go back to his ship and continue on. This really showed, I think, to some degree that naval officers were politically naive in the extreme. He didn't seem to understand the political or the public fallout from what had occurred.
I don't think he realised quite, I suppose, to borrow from the political arena, the blowtorch on the belly was going to be applied as and where it was appropriate to whoever it was, without any respect as a persons.
There'd been this frightful collision. The ship had been lost and 82 sailors were dead. It's not something to be merely mouthed about.
Menzies had decided the Voyager inquiry would be heard by a single commissioner, Sir John Spicer. Spicer seemed a far from independent choice. He was a former Liberal politician who'd been Attorney General in a previous Menzies government.
The trouble is that Royal Commissions, by their nature, are blunt instruments. If people are in adversarial situations, very often they don't tell the whole truth. They tell the truth necessary to make sure their own position and standing is not imperilled.
The families of the late Captain Stevens and his senior officers on Voyager all had full legal representation at government expense. Robertson, Melbourne's commanding officer, did not.
He was familiar with the general format of a naval inquiry, and he felt that it wasn't a matter where he needed lawyers, that he would go in and put his trust in the machinery of the Royal Commission.
It would be only natural with a collision like that, at least to contemplate the fact that somebody might be to blame, or that a collection of people or circumstances might be to blame. We just didn't know.
I want to put it to you specifically. The fact is, you were prepared to agree to any version of this collision which you understand to be the one acceptable to Captain Robertson. That is the fact, is it not?
No, it is not.
One doesn't like having to cut people up at the bar table, but in pursuing whatever your task is, you have to do that sometimes.
Everybody on the bridge of Voyager was dead except Evans, the technical operator. On the other hand, the whole bridge of Melbourne was available. In those circumstances, it behoves anybody inquiring into anything to test the evidence of those who are alive, because you may be maligning or criticising somebody who's dead and can't defend himself.
The truth finally dawned on Robertson. He was on trial and on his own.
The blatant disloyalty of the Naval Board was just so apparent, just terrible. And I mean, they completely deserted him. He was bereft of support.
The Naval Board came along to protect itself, to limit the political fallout. And if John Robertson was the man to die to save the nation, then they weren't particularly upset to see that.
After just 7 days of hearings, Melbourne's captain decided to engage senior counsel. On his Admiral's advice, he telegraphed the Prime Minister asking that the cost of his legal representation be met by the government.
And the next thing I hear, the Attorney-General has refused any counsel. I saw the Attorney-General and he said, no, there's going to be no, junior counsel for Robertson.
John Jess, a Liberal backbencher, was related by marriage to Captain Robertson. His decision to challenge his own government marked a crucial turning point in the whole Voyager saga.
And I said, well, look, I'll tell you the party meeting's tomorrow. And if you don't want it on the agenda by tomorrow, I would suggest you have a rethink about it. Within about half an hour, I'm sure, it came back and they said, well, we have decided to give him representation. But, I mean, these are the things that just happen.
When his time finally came, the captain of the Melbourne was in the witness box for 6 days. He endured more than 30 hours of examination. Allegations were made that Melbourne's bridge may not have kept sufficient watch and that the carrier failed to use her siren or radio to warn Voyager.
We have to remember that we're dealing with ships operating at high speed at night. It's a destroyer's responsibility to keep out of the way of the larger ship, the carrier. The carrier, there is a certain point where it can't do anything anymore.
But buried within the growing volumes of commission transcripts was a bombshell. Almost as an afterthought, Judge Spicer heard brief evidence from a minor witness, Barry John Hyland. Hyland had been a steward on Voyager at the time of the collision.
Served them out about 7:15, I think, and I was asked to supply the captain. And Captain Stevens a drink. And I served him that brandy.
Did he ask you for something?
Yes.
What did he ask for?
For a brandy. A triple brandy.
A triple brandy. Is that 3 ounces, is it?
That's 3 brandy tots in the 1 glass.
Did you see him drink it?
No, I just left it.
And he later buzzed for you to come and get the empty glass?
Yes.
For that one brief moment, the cat was out of the bag. There was reason to believe that Voyager's captain, against strict naval convention, had consumed hard liquor while on duty at sea. According to the steward, that drink was served no more than 90 minutes before the collision.
I gave him the brandy, there's no doubt about that. I gave him the brandy, whether they believe me or not, but they weren't very supportive, I can tell you that.
I arranged to see the man who gave that evidence, the Stuart Hyland, met him in the city and argued very hotly that I didn't believe that Stevens would have been stupid enough, irresponsible enough to drink at sea. But he was insistent, and I knew that he was speaking the truth.
Only 3 bodies were ever recovered from Voyager. Post-mortem analysis, done more than 60 hours after the collision, confirmed alcohol still in the blood of all 3. They included Voyager's navigator and Captain Duncan Stevens himself. But that crucial pathology evidence on blood alcohol was only tendered to the Commission in writing, not read aloud.
Now, it may be, if there was a fundamental problem about Stevens and his drinking, for which I don't think there was any other support at the time we did things, it may be that that would have been a relevant thing to consider if one had known about it. But as far as I remember, we had no consciousness of this.
By the time the Royal Commission on the loss of Voyager concluded, HMAS Melbourne had been repaired and fitted with a new bow. For its part, the government dared to hope the Navy's reputation might now be restored as swiftly as their flagship. Fewer than 20 pages of Judge Spicer's final report were directly concerned with the facts of the tragedy.
The collision was caused by reason of the Voyager making a turn beyond 020 degrees. It is not possible to form any firm conclusion why Voyager did this.
That finding did not prevent Sir John from aiming strong criticism directly at Melbourne's captain.
Captain Robertson should have become aware that Voyager was engaged in an unusual manoeuvre. Prudence dictated the desirability of some warning to Voyager. It is, I think, regrettable that none was given.
The government and the Navy had their scapegoat.
The first Royal Commission, I think, in many ways got things completely wrong. It got the wrong outcome It criticised people who ought not to have been criticised. Even its description of how the collision occurred was subsequently shown to be faulty. It didn't ask the right questions. It didn't get at some of the real systemic problems that existed in the Navy.
The admirals at Fleet Headquarters were relieved to find that Spicer's report made no mention of the alcohol found in Stephen's blood. Nor did it mention the triple brandy the captain had apparently been served on the night of the collision. Not a word.
I would have thought that somebody said something to Spicer that, well, perhaps if you can bring in that Voyager may be guilty, but don't specify anybody particular, but you can bring in that, you know, Melbourne might have done A, B and C.
Sir John Spicer would certainly have known Sir Jack Stevens because he was a departmental head, and Spicer, of course, would have known all the principal departmental heads. So there was some criticism by John Jess of Spicer being appointed when he would have known Stephen Senior.
But even before the Royal Commission report was released, the admirals had made up their minds. Robertson received a brisk 3-line letter from Sir Hastings Harrington, Chief of the Naval Staff.
He had this letter from the first naval member appointing him to HMAS Watson, shore job and demotion. And that was, he read the letter in front of me and he said, well, that's it. End of story.
Captain Robertson did not go quietly. From the front lawn of his Sydney home, he used the media to give the Admiral his reply.
This, sir, as you will realise, places me in an intolerable position. In the circumstances, therefore, I request that I may be permitted to resign my commission as an officer in Her Majesty's fleet.
Robertson's decision to resign in public was a pointed gesture of dissent, and it involved considerable sacrifice. Married with children, he was giving up not just his career, but a secure salary and most of his pension.
Well, I thought it was disgraceful. I mean, there's a big thing in the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, that once you have something like this, you're given an appointment, you know, a long way back, and you'll sit there for the rest of your life. You'll never get far.
He wasn't suspended from the service, he wasn't discharged, he chose to go, and because of the method of his resignation, was not entitled to any superannuation. So a long and really quite distinguished naval career ended in great ignominy, and then the insult of not being able to be granted a pension.
Early in 1965, Robertson, now a civilian, hosted a dinner at his Sydney home. Among the guests that night was Peter Caban, who'd been second in command to Duncan Stevens in Voyager. Frustrated, Caban had resigned from the Navy just 4 weeks before the collision with Melbourne. He confirmed rumours that Voyager's captain was often drunk during the year leading up to the tragedy off Jervis Bay.
In fact, it got to the stage where we had a discussion about it. And I said, what do I do to you, with you when you're drunk? And he said, just say, sir, you're drunk, but you must call me sir.
Robertson was now gathering material for a book on the collision. He asked Caban for a background statement about his time with Stevens in Voyager. Caban agreed.
So he brought a tape recorder, small tape recorder, over to my home, and I sat on the edge of the bed one night before retiring and just spoke continuously into it until I had exhausted my immediate memory.
It was an extraordinary statement. I mean, the things that he could remember, how he felt, what he saw, the import of the particular actions he was describing was quite incredible.
Captain Stevens drank for very long periods in harbour until he became violently ill. He had disgraced himself, been sick all over the place, in Captain Dollard's home.
I think I was just simply trying to get it out. I was haunted by it. I mean, literally, I was haunted by it. I could not think of anything else.
And all I ever wanted was for the Prime Minister or the Minister for the Navy or the Minister for Defence or somebody to question Gaban, but not a bloody soul from start to finish ever questioned that man from beginning to end, and it became an absolute outrage.
It confirmed my suspicions that there was a cover-up, that they did not want to know the truth about what was going on in Voyager.
So I said, OK, well, I'll try and see if the Prime Minister can see him. And Menzies said, oh, well, you know, after all, my boy, it's all over now, and everybody's dead, and, you know, just leave things alone.
By late 1966, Menzies had retired, leaving Harold Holt to lead the coalition in a torrid federal election.
The choice which will lie ahead of you on November the 26th.
Holt won the election, but within that victory were the seeds of a new confrontation over the Voyager disaster. In Sydney, the safe Liberal seat of Warringah had been secured for the government by a new member, the barrister Edward St John.
Like a lot of people who have spent their career at the bar, he was quite articulate and handy on his feet and a man of strong opinions. So he wasn't there to serve any apprenticeship.
He felt that in politics you really could achieve something. He felt that there was so much more that he could do in politics than he could in the law. He didn't understand how difficult life in politics could be.
Ted St John survived just one term in Parliament, but he reignited the Voyager saga.
And I just thought, you know, I could come in as a lawyer and just sort it all out and work out a compromise. And then I came to realise that the government was standing firm, and I became more and more convinced that the truth had been covered up and that it would be my duty in cooperation with Jess and others to bring it out.
St John came to me and he said, do you mind if I come and check with you? I said, no, I don't. I said, I will show you everything I know. I said, you can go and see Gaban, you can go and see Robertson.
St John questioned both Caban and Robertson at length. To his astonishment, he learned that Caban had been interviewed by the Royal Commission lawyers before the 1964 hearings began.
I was asked to go to see Mr. Smythe, QC, who was counsel assisting the First Royal Commission.
During that interview, Caban outlined for Smythe the link between Voyager's captain and alcohol.
I had been to see the survivors of Voyager at Balmoral Naval Hospital, and I was alarmed when they told me that the captain was drunk at the time of the collision. When one told me, I turned and asked others, and they said yes, absolutely. They were very angry, and they were absolutely of the conviction that he was drunk. I was told, we'll be seeing a lot of you at the Royal Commission. Those are the words.
But HMAS Voyager's former second-in-command was not called as a witness. His evidence of Stephen's drunken behaviour was never heard.
I think the reason Caban wasn't called was that he was not on the ship at the time of the collision. There was no basis for saying that on the night of the collision, Stephens was under the influence of alcohol, or that his judgment was affected by alcohol, whatever else may have been said about it.
I think they just didn't want to face up to what had really happened. Certainly didn't want the public to know about it.
I don't gainsay that another council might have taken the view that he should call Caban. But once you called him, you really did open up a can of worms which seemed to us to be likely to get way off the track.
By now, the Caban statement was being circulated confidentially in Canberra. If true, it threw the findings of the Royal Commission into serious question. In the government party room, backbenchers argued Captain Robertson's cause and for the Voyager inquiry to be reopened.
I did not want them to do anything except check this man's story. Nobody did a thing. Nobody did anything at all. And in the end, I said to Chip, and I said, I think to Harold Holt, that either if something is not forthcoming, if the party room rejects me, I have then got to go to the Parliament, and they knew bloody well that I meant it.
John Jess started the fire, but it was really Ted St. John who was the catalyst, who turned it into a real backbench issue, because he had the sort of fervour behind him.
And I was appalled, really, that government ministers and public servants should cover up the truth the way they did.
By early 1967, the Voyager problem was in the lap of Don Chipp, the ambitious new Navy minister. He marshalled the resources of his department to challenge the truth of Caban's allegations.
According to the Caban statement, Captain Stevens was a drunkard. Other seamen officers were mentioned who could verify these facts, whether they were facts or not, whether Stevens was drunk, whether he crawled out on his hands and knees out of a dinner, whether he vomited on a bed. And so I decided to send questionnaires to all those who were mentioned and named, saying, do you recall this? Give us your version of it. All of them denied it, totally, except one, the doctor.
Well, he went under the nickname of Drunken Duncan, so that sort of doesn't disguise a great deal.
Michael Tiller had been Voyager's doctor under Duncan Stevens during the destroyer's 1963 Far East cruise.
In Tokyo, we went to the Australian ambassador's residence for a function, and the captain got very drunk that night, and he didn't appear on the bridge when we left Tokyo, and I had to treat him in his cabin, ready for the results of excessive drinking.
The Naval Board, on behalf of the government, sent Dr. Tiller their set of questions about the Caban allegations. Tiller could confirm repeated times and places where his captain had been drunk, full as a boot, and that senior naval officers had been told. Sam Landau, the Naval Board Secretary, learned more than he wished to know.
I had a phone call from Mr. Landau, and it was concerning my signal or replies to Caban's statement, and I was talking to him on the phone, and I think he may have put it to me that did I want these recorded, because I think he asked me if could he destroy them. He was certainly suggestive that if I wanted them destroyed, he'd be happy to do that.
Landau looks at this and sees it's not too effective as far as the Royal Commission says, well, do you mind if I scrub it and can we, give us a new one? Well, if that's the way it's played, I don't know what sort of games we play.
But events were now moving beyond the government's control. One newspaper had already pieced together a detailed outline of the scandal under a powerful headline.
Prime Ministers and governments don't relish inquiries unnecessarily in their mind. But as time went on, here were Liberal parliamentarians were coming up with information of a kind that the Prime Minister in the end could not ignore.
They continued to agitate, and finally, Cabinet, I think, members of Cabinet got the feeling, if we don't settle this, it's going to explode.
Holt actually invited us to use, as he put it, the forms of the House to ventilate the matter if we saw fit. I don't think he ever thought that we would. He certainly couldn't have foreseen what happened when we did.
The debate was listed for May 16. St. John, a new member, would be speaking in Parliament for the first time.
He said to me, do you realise that if I speak in this debate, I will antagonise so many people that really it will be the end to any promotion in this career. It will be the end of my career just before I've even started it.
The word had got around that St. John was going to drop a bucket. You knew you were going to get a first-class performance from St. John under any circumstances. Under these ones, it was going to be something special.
There was a fair buzz around the old Parliament House and the press gallery that St. John was really getting stirred up and this would be something to watch.
So the galleries were packed, and when he spoke, not a sound could be heard.
Is it irrelevant that the captain of the destroyer, when in port, was perpetually drunk? Or have I lost the meaning of the word irrelevant?
At which point Harold Holt, obviously furious, turned around, glared at St. John.
Harold Holt, listening to all the proceedings all the afternoon, was so stirred up that he interrupted.
And what is the meaning of the word evidence?
St. John came back and pounced immediately.
I did not expect to be interrupted by the Prime Minister.
And you could have heard a pin drop, A, because of St. John's allegation, and B, because the Prime Minister, of all people, had broken the recognised convention that any member making his maiden speech would not be interrupted, and yet this was a member from his own side of the House.
As can happen if you suddenly put your foot in your mouth occasionally, you know it usually straight away, and I think Harold knew it straight away that he had done something that he shouldn't have done.
It's not too much to say it destroyed Holt, because it was very clear that he was under immense pressure.
Holt interjected, Chip interjected, the whole atmosphere was, you know, absolutely chock with full of emotion and drama. Chip actually had to be restrained. Snedden was sitting beside Chip, and he actually had to hold him down. He was so furious, you know.
Denigrating the Navy, denigrating fine seamen, denigrating a wonderful man, Captain Stevens, calling him a drunkard, and the press, of course, printing it.
St. John had used the privilege of Parliament to say in public what the Spicer Commission managed to conceal. Duncan Stevens was a chronic drunkard and unfit to command. Worse, the Navy must have known about his health problems, but did nothing.
I felt there was only one thing I could do, and that's speak out. Damn silly, you might say, from a political point of view, but there we are.
It was a shambles. I mean, Holt was a very pleasant man and so on, but the Voyager disaster and his conduct in the debate on it destroyed his confidence.
Harold Holt realised his blunder and, well, the fact that he appointed or announced a Royal Commission within about 3 days of all this was significant.
For the only time in Australian history, there would be a second Royal Commission investigating the same incident, the loss of HMAS Voyager. It convened in the same Sydney courtroom as the first. The commissioners would now determine whether the drinking habits and seamanship of Captain Duncan Stevens had made him unfit to retain command of HMAS Voyager. The key witness was Peter Caban himself.
The Navy tried desperately to break me down. They almost succeeded. I was absolutely under attack. I felt from the bench as well as from the representatives of the Stevens family and the Navy.
I told him at the time I thought he'd stuck his neck out a long way, which wasn't far wrong. It was obvious to me that the Navy and everyone else would do everything in the world to crush him, whether he was right or wrong.
I think Caban conducted himself with a great deal of dignity. I mean, there were many people who were there for the sole purpose of destroying him, and yet he continued to hold to the line of his evidence. He continued to relate a series of incidents that showed that Duncan Stevens was not fit to command.
Not every detail in the Caban statement proved entirely reliable, but there was ample evidence to support the thrust of his claims. Voyager's captain had repeatedly been drunk during the year prior to the collision with Melbourne.
Even in the 60s, alcoholic was a nasty word. It was almost a horrified silence when I said that I thought he was an alcoholic, and you could have heard a pin drop.
Dr. Birrell of Victoria said it was clear the man was a chronic alcoholic, and the Royal Commission sat very uncomfortably while he gave opinions completely contrary to what they wanted to find.
I have no doubt at all that his behaviour over a period of time indicated excessive consumption of alcohol.
It was the worst year of my life. That year, it started off the best because I was so proud to be Navy Minister, proud of the Navy, what it was doing. But then to have the Royal Commission and I had to read every day the transcripts, the Navy went through a terrible time then. And I wasn't very happy with that.
This is the only film record of Stevens on duty as captain of Voyager. He's welcoming the Pakistani High Commissioner. Voyager had won the fleet cricket competition. Stevens appears quite normal, yet Caban's evidence was that the captain had been badly hungover just hours before this ceremony.
He suddenly appeared in the sick bay and said that he wanted me to give him some stimulants. And I said that I wouldn't, that I didn't think that was correct. And we had quite a scene about it, and I just said, no, I refuse to give you any stimulants, and he left.
Other evidence makes it quite clear that on previous occasions, when he had been unwise in his drinking, Captain Stevens had helped his recovery by taking amphetamines.
But the Commission did not pursue the amphetamines issue. It heard evidence that Stevens' drinking aggravated an old ulcer condition. Voyager's records may have been falsified to hide his long periods of incapacity at sea. Key documents held by the Naval Board were somehow lost or destroyed after the first Royal Commission. Yet despite these scandals, the original findings by Sir John Spicer, critical of Melbourne, and Captain Robertson, remained.
They knew, I think, that Spicer had got it wrong, but opening this up was really, really tricky. And it was, I think, a bit of sleight of hand on the behalf of some council that allowed them to do that.
My fundamental task was to put the shining white armour on John Robertson. I had to show that, assuming Caban's statement was substantially true, how did that affect Spicer's navigation findings?
If Stevens was found to be unfit to command, then and only then did the Spicer findings come up for reconsideration.
No destroyer captain of Duncan Stevens' experience, capacity, would ever have made this mistake. But, we said, Stevens wasn't the man that Spicer thought him to be. He was a sick man and prone to error, and it was an error on his part which caused the collision.
Gordon Samuels finally convinced the Commission that the original Spicer findings on Melbourne's role could now be reconsidered. For Captain Robertson, the long wait was nearly over.
He'd been absolutely miserable throughout the first Royal Commission. The second, I think he almost enjoyed. It was like playing a good game of chess.
The transcript, statements and written exhibits of the Second Royal Commission fill 20 bound volumes. The Commissioners handed their report to Parliament in March 1968. They now found that all blame for the collision lay with Voyager.
We are satisfied that the criticism of Captain Robertson made by Sir John Spicer is not justified. No blame or criticism attaches to Captain Robertson.
The government soon made an act of grace payment of $60,000 to compensate Robertson for his loss of pension. Melbourne's captain would rock the boat no more.
Well, naturally, I'm very pleased that they recorded the correct, I think, the correct answer about the facts of the collision, and next pleased about the results as far as I myself am concerned.
I was relieved that it was over. I felt that Captain Robertson had got out of it very well. I felt that in a perfect world they would have made findings on some things that was critical for them to find to my credit, and they hadn't done that, but then it would never be done.
Peter Caban is a person with a great conscience, a great sense of right and wrong, and yes, he was used all right, and but for the fact that he was a good witness and eventually a lot of the truth came out, but for that he could have been publicly disgraced and ruined.
I think he was a man full of sadness, that a ship he had loved and served in had been cut into, many men had died, and he felt, I think, deep down, if he'd taken certain actions in 1963, Duncan Stevens wouldn't have been command in 1964, and the collision wouldn't have occurred.
Well, for 20 years, I had that feeling of guilt. Sorry.
absolute proof of the cover-up within the Navy and government didn't surface until almost 30 years later. Voyager's gunnery officer under Stevens back in 1963 was David Martin. After a successful naval career and knighthood, he'd been Governor of New South Wales.
Some days before he died, Admiral David Martin granted me an interview and we talked about Voyager. I had portions of his Royal Commission evidence. And I said, "Sir, what do you make of these things that you said in 1963? What do you make of them now?" And he looked across the table, and he was not far from death, and said, "Well, it's bullshit." Stevens was hopeless. He said it was the most dysfunctional wardroom that I'd ever been in. He said, "I feared for the safety of the ship." But he said, what was I to do?
Many of the junior officers didn't feel that they could break ranks and say what they really felt. They were interested in loyalty to their service. It is very hard for a junior officer to say something that is going to affect his promotion prospects in the future.
The Navy's failure to deal with Duncan Stevens' health problems may well have cost 82 lives. The failure of the First Royal Commission to hear evidence from Peter Caban then obscured that truth.
If we didn't do it as well as it could have been done, I'm sorry to say that was the best we could do at the time. And we did what had to be done.
The Voyager scandal was the beginning of the end for the Conservative coalition that had ruled Australia for 20 years. Jess and St John challenged their own government on a matter of principle, and they'd won. Within 4 years, Labor would be in power.
I would think that members of the armed forces have to realise that they have to earn the respect of the public. The whole process destroyed the illusion that the Liberals had expertise in defence matters.
I think it was what we currently call an inflection point in Conservative politics. The lock which the Conservative parties had on the defence and foreign affairs issues started to come unstuck.
By 1969, Melbourne had been back on active service for almost 5 years. Then, on the night of June 3rd, during joint exercises with the US Navy off the Philippines, the unthinkable.
The aircraft carrier Melbourne, and in tonight's news, pictures received by satellite of the damage suffered in yesterday's collision.
It had happened again. 74 American sailors perished in a collision with the US destroyer Frank E. Evans. The circumstances were remarkably similar to the Voyager disaster. Again, the Australian carrier was not to blame, but the coincidence defied belief. HMAS Melbourne must be the only ship to have sunk 2 destroyers in peacetime and none in war.